それではこれから、トーマス・コービリエル、
We will now open the conference on the occasion of Thomas Kåberger's return to Japan, the energy crisis and the role of renewables. My name is Okubo. I will be serving as the moderator for this conference. Dr. Kåberger is in Japan for the first time in 2 years, so we have more than 800 people having registered for this conference, including those here physically. As the Russian invasion of Ukraine accelerates the surge in world energy prices, there is active discussion on the issue of decarbonization and energy security. Today, we will hear about the role of renewable energy as well as how Europe tries to deal with the crisis. The presentation will be made from Dr. Kåberger, Chair of the Executive Board. After that, we will hear a report from Professor Takahashi of Tsuru University, and then we will have a discussion session. The first speaker is Dr. Tomas Kåberger, the Chair of the Executive Board. His area of specialty is physical resource theory. Currently, he is Professor of Industrial Energy Policy at Chalmers University of Technology. Prior to joining the REI, he was Director General of the National Swedish Energy Agency from 2008 to 2011. He has been engaged in the development of industry to realize a sustainable energy system, as well as in the business community as an advisor to various companies. Without further ado, let us get started. We will have simultaneous interpretation services available. Please set the channel on your receiver to either English or Japanese. And if you're joining us online, please select the language through the globe button on your screen. So handing it over to you, Dr. Kåberger, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Okubo-san. We are at a very special moment in time with fossil fuel prices reaching levels that none of us have seen before. This provides a challenge, but also an opportunity for accelerated, profitable development of less environmentally polluting energy in the world. The backdrop to this development is the development that has already gone on for a few decades, whereby increased deployment of renewable electricity generation technologies have resulted in lower prices, lower costs for renewable energy, and therefore lower prices. The global solar development has followed this graph, and in the last few years, the dominating country in the development of solar electricity has been China. Japan is still among the top countries in the world, but it is an important issue that China has not only become the major installer of solar PV for electricity generation, but also become the industrial leader in producing solar cells and solar panels. This used to be a position held by Japan, and there have also been many American and European companies active. But for a few years, China has taken over this industry, and I think we may predict that both the United States and Europe will in the coming years make major efforts to come back as major suppliers of this technology. And I think that is something for Japan to consider as well, given the industrial capacity and knowledge that exist in this country. I said prices have come down, and they did come down in a spectacular tempo in the year 2016. We saw in the world the first procured electricity from solar coming below 3 cents per kilowatt hour. In May 2016, it was just a few months later below 2.5, and prices continued to fall below 2. and then below 1.5 cent. And finally, the still lowest price offered for solar electricity in the world in Saudi Arabia last year at just about 1 US cent per kilowatt hour. This is remarkably cheap electricity. Fatih Birol of the International Energy Agency said this is the cheapest electricity ever in world history. And I think there is no challenge to that statement. While these extremely low numbers are achieved in the countries with the most intense solar radiation, countries like Japan or Northern Europe are within a factor 2 of solar radiation per capita per square meter. So the cost of solar electricity does not need to be more than twice as high, provided we can build as efficiently as they do in these world-leading projects, and we have the sort of knowledge of building as efficiently. Global wind capacity has increased to just about the same level. Those of you who remember the previous picture of solar saw that also solar was just above 800 gigawatt in installed capacity. It seems as if solar overtook wind power last year in installed capacity, but now the difference is so small that the uncertainty of the statistics is in the same range as the difference between the two. However, it is still clear that wind generates more electricity because the capacity factor, the produced electricity per installed gigawatt, is roughly twice as high for wind as for solar globally. In wind power, too, China has become the world leader. There was a remarkable development in China from the year 2005 to 2010, when China went from having virtually no wind power installed to having more than any other country in the world. And over the last 20 years, or 15 years at least, China has installed in the order of 2 wind power plants per hour, day and night, all around the year. This is an area where the US, Germany, India, Spain are now the top countries. My home country, Sweden, does very well if you calculate this on a per capita basis. And we now have in the order of 15–20% of our electricity from wind power. But Japan is missing in this development, which is a pity because Japan has ample resources, both onshore, especially on Hokkaido, but also offshore. And this is one of the areas where Japan also has significant opportunities of increasing the supply to the Japanese electricity system. Also for wind power, the year 2016 was a year when cost came down rapidly. The first contracts offered in the world between $25 and $30 per megawatt hour, 2.5 to 3 cents per kilowatt hour, came in Morocco in 2016. And in 2017, what is still, I believe, the world record in low-priced onshore wind power was an offer by Enel to produce electricity from wind in Mexico at $17.7 per megawatt hour. Here, the cost levels in Northern Europe are quite similar in this order of magnitude. 2 to 3 cents per kilowatt hour is now possible. But what is remarkable and particularly relevant for Japan is that also the cost of offshore wind power has come down dramatically. And here too, it was in 2016. In the summer of 2016, offshore wind was offered off the Dutch coast in Northern Europe by Danish company Dong, now Ørsted, that some of you know of. And they offered to supply electricity from offshore wind at just above 70 euros per megawatt hour. Still expensive, but at the time record low. Only 2 months later, Vattenfall, the Swedish power company, won a bidding process off the Danish west coast, offering to produce wind power, offshore wind power at 60 euros per megawatt hour. And another 2 months later, Vattenfall won the Kriegers Flak project off the Danish east coast with a bid below 50 euros per megawatt hour. A dramatic decrease in cost over just a few months, mainly driven by better capacity utilization, scale up of offshore wind in Northern Europe, and the opportunity to assume that you would actually be able to use all the infrastructure, all the people involved in the construction in a continuous manner. So they would not have to work for a while and then be laid off for a while and then come back, but they could continue from one project to another, and so could the equipment, the cranes and things used in the installation of offshore wind power. When this contract was signed, it was criticized for being unrealistically cheap. But it is enjoyable to note that when this project was completed this autumn, it was completed before time schedule and below budget. And that was possible despite the corona pandemic, or as the head of wind power at Vattenfall said, maybe thanks to the pandemic. Because during the pandemic, it was absolutely prohibited for unnecessary visits to the construction sites. So she said, none of us bosses could go there and disturb them. They could just work. Though the linear decrease in the cost of offshore wind power could not continue, then if that had been the case, offshore wind would have been for free by the summer of 2017. What we saw in the beginning of 2017 were the first contract where companies offered to produce offshore wind power without any subsidies. They were confident that they could produce electricity from offshore wind plants and compete with the other electricity generators on the spot market. And the market price would be sufficient to cover all the cost of the offshore wind power plant. In this case, what the bidding companies got was that they were assigned an area in the sea that they were allowed to use, and they did get a connection to the grid. The Netherlands made a similar procurement where they actually assumed that all bidders would be able to produce electricity without subsidy. So in this bidding process, it was more of a beauty contest or a competence contest where the bidding companies had to show that they were experienced, that they were trustworthy, that they would actually build, that they could deliver a lot of electricity from a given area at sea. And to ensure that their self-confidence was backed up, they also had to pay a large amount of money to the Dutch government, which they would lose if they failed to do what they promised to do. And this was not a small sum, it was hundreds of millions of euros. Recently in Denmark, there was a similar procurement where many companies offered the lowest possible price. They would have to pay their own infrastructure, and the contract was somewhat complicated, but it is now expected that the winning company will pay about 400 million euros to the Danish government for the right to use the sea to produce electricity. So they will earn a profit in relation to the spot market and pay back to the Danish government for the right of using this part of the sea. So not only does wind power at sea in Northern Europe now outcompete other sources of electricity on the market, they do it with such profit that they are able to contribute to the government or to other customers in the system. A surprisingly fast development over the last 5-6 years. This development has not only made it possible to substitute other sources of electricity in the electricity generating system, renewable electricity has now become cheaper than the market price of crude oil, for example. And this is not only something that is true today with the extremely high prices, it was true already a year ago when prices were in the order of $60 per barrel of oil. The fact that renewable electricity has become cheaper than oil is somehow hidden by the fact that the market price of oil is given in dollars per barrel when the cost and prices for electricity is given in dollars per megawatt hour. So you need to do this conversion that I illustrate in this table, in this diagram. Today, the oil price is around $110 per barrel. And if you use this simple diagram, you see that that is the equivalent of somewhere between $65 and $70 per megawatt hour. And you just saw in the previous slides that renewable electricity can now be produced at costs in the range of $10 to $30 per megawatt hour, meaning that renewable electricity, the total cost of renewable electricity, is now less than half of the energy cost of oil, of crude oil. It's not a matter of competition in oil-based electricity compared to renewable electricity. It's renewable electricity compared to the energy content of crude oil. The result of this milestone in the development of renewables being passed is that it's now feasible to use renewable electricity to substitute oil in other sectors. And one of the sectors where this development is now very rapid is the electrification in the transport sector. First, in road transport, where now the countries with high shares of renewable electricity is also becoming countries with a high share of electric road vehicles. In Norway, the sales of plug-in cars is now in the order of 80 to 90% of new cars sold. A challenge for those car-producing companies that have not been so fast in providing plug-in electric vehicles. But it's not only private cars, it's also buses, and many countries in the world are now deploying electric buses, partly for climate reasons, for economic reasons, for local air pollution reasons. And one of the cities that have come furthest is Shenzhen in China, where they have 100% battery electric buses in the city bus system. This article from 2018 talked about 16,000 buses. There's now supposed to be more than 20,000 battery electric buses in Shenzhen. This can also be used for ferries. This was a Norwegian ferry that was built several years ago, originally with significant state subsidies, because it was thought that this was something very difficult to do. I've been told by the company operating this ferry that they discovered afterwards this was very profitable. They would not have needed a subsidy. And many other companies operating short distance car ferries like this have discovered that that is true. Also, some larger car ferries like this one between Sweden and Denmark is now electrified. And even electric aviation is possible. I must admit that some 15 years ago, I did claim that we would never see battery electric airplanes because batteries were too heavy. When I said that in front of a large audience, there was a very nice young man in the audience. He didn't protest, but he came up afterwards with a little note and said, "Check this website." And I checked the website, and that was a link to a Chinese company already some 15 years ago offering a two-seater battery electric aircraft with a range of a couple of hours. This is Airbus, the big European airplane manufacturer who offer a two-seater trainer aircraft that's battery electric. And we now have several companies in the world developing larger aircrafts. Heart Aerospace is one that is constructing a 19-seater aircraft. And they can show that this will be cheaper per seat for ranges up to 500 kilometers than conventional airplanes, because electric aircrafts are easier to maintain and control and will provide better safety and lower cost. And with smaller airplanes, they will also have more frequent trips between cities and provide a shorter expected traveling time. As the development of electric transport, battery electric transport, required upscaling of battery manufacturing, something where Japan has contributed significantly to the technological development, the scale-up has resulted in lower cost of batteries. It's about a decrease by 90%, down to 10% of the cost per stored kilowatt hour in the last decade, mainly thanks to the upscaling and increased experience accumulating in the industry. As a result, batteries may be used also in the electricity grid to provide short-term grid stability. Old power companies tend to refer to inertia as the way of guaranteeing stable frequency in the grid. But with large, low-cost batteries and power electronics, this can be achieved at much lower cost with batteries. And this South Australian battery that was installed a few years ago by Tesla proved how this reduced cost. And now the installation of large batteries in Australia, the US, Britain, and so on is going quite fast. And it's difficult to keep track of which is the biggest battery in the world now, because especially the US and Australia seem to be competing of having the largest batteries installed. And many of them are installed where you have at the same time closed fossil-fueled electricity production plants. They have the infrastructure, and sometimes now batteries may substitute gas-fired power stations that were used regularly just a few hours per day, because batteries are cheaper to keep and they can store access solar and wind power to be used during these peak load periods, often typically in the evening, where you would otherwise have had to burn expensive gas. But stabilizing the grid with batteries may not necessarily be done by large batteries dedicated to supporting the grid. In Germany, Volkswagen has formed a power company, a car manufacturer forming a power company with the idea that they will provide the electricity to all owners of Volkswagen plug-in electric cars. And they will do so according to an agreement with the owners where the power company will be allowed to use a part of the battery capacity. And that part will be used to sell grid stability services to the local grids. It will be used to trade electricity in the way that you will charge the battery when electricity is cheap and sell electricity back to the grid when electricity is expensive. And the vision of this company is that they will earn so much by operating the battery that they will be able to give electricity for free to the owner of the car. They have not yet promised to do so, but they have the ambition to be able to do so, thanks to the efficient utilization of the batteries. And there are similar ideas floated by companies in the US at the moment, offering very cheap electricity charging, but still charging. While oil has always been the most expensive fossil fuel per unit energy, the second is usually fossil methane gas. Comparing the price of methane gas with the price of electricity is just as difficult as comparing oil price and electricity price. the often used unit for gas price is dollars per million British thermal units. And some of us brought up with the scientific SI unit system find these British thermal units terribly complicated to calculate with. But the typical price of gas per million British thermal units, it was sort of 5 to 10, maybe $12 per million British thermal units. And if you looked at that in the diagram, you see, oh, it's okay, it's about $24 per megawatt hour. Yeah, some of the better solar and wind projects in the world will produce cheaper, but there's still a bit of competition in this area. But then came this war in the Ukraine and the difficulties in getting gas from Russia, and suddenly things have changed dramatically. We're now off scale compared to what I and others had in our diagrams just a year ago. So today, with gas prices being much higher than they used to be, renewable electricity is much cheaper than fossil gas. And we will come back to the consequences of that later. Coal is the cheapest of all fossil fuels. It's difficult, it's dirty. Transforming it into useful energy is usually quite expensive and the efficiency is not so high. But the price has been low. So with the typical coal price of $60 per ton, that is the equivalent of about $8 per megawatt hour. And it's difficult for renewable electricity to compete directly if you disregard the efficiency and environmental issues. But coal too has gone through a dramatic price increase in the last few months. So again, we have a situation where the old diagrams are no longer relevant and renewable electricity is so much cheaper than coal. And again, note, it's not a matter of renewable electricity being cheaper than electricity produced from coal. It's renewable electricity being cheaper per unit energy than the energy content of the coal. This opens up for more substitution of fossil fuels in industry with electricity. And one of the early attempts in Europe was a consortium formed by the Swedish steel manufacturing company SSAB, the mining company LKAB, and the power company Vattenfall. And they had the idea that they would use electricity to produce hydrogen and then use hydrogen instead of coal when reducing the iron ore, chemically reducing it into sponge iron. And the first demonstration that this process worked took place last summer when the pilot plant produced the first sponge iron. And this was the hybrid plant that they built together. Then SSAB produced the first steel from this sponge iron 2 months later in August. And another two months later, the vehicle manufacturer Volvo had produced the first vehicle using this fossil-free steel. And Hybrid, as well as a competing company, H2 Green Steel, are now enjoying a situation where there are many customers who are willing to sign contracts to buy this fossil-free steel, even if they have not yet built their own production plant. So the demand for fossil-free steel in the world is clearly significant. And one of the major group of companies that are interested in fossil-free steel, that is the automotive industry making vehicles. And their rationale behind this desire for carbon-free steel or coal-free steel is that when you have electrified vehicles, one of the main, maybe often the most important source of greenhouse gas emissions in the life cycle of the vehicle is actually the production of the steel that makes up a large part of the vehicle itself. So they want to have good life cycle performance, and therefore they want fossil-free steel. Yeah, so you see here some examples of the companies that are contracting these the expected production from these future fossil-free steel plants even before they have been built. And for those of you who are involved in new industrial projects, it's very nice to have sold the product before you need to raise the finance to build the plant. It's easier to raise money when you're in that situation. So now let's come back and talk a little about the crisis that have developed over the last half a year because of the Russian invasion in the Ukraine in particular. The price increases that I just illustrated have had a dramatic effect on the world's energy markets. And one could say, in a constructive way, that Putin, by launching his war, has achieved what climate policy makers in the world have failed to achieve, and that is a global increase in the cost of burning fossil fuels. So the market effect of the war is similar to the effect of a global carbon tax. This makes energy efficiency and renewable energy more profitable than ever before. Most satisfying for those who have already invested. If they did so for environmental reasons, or they did so for policy reasons, or whatever reason they had, they are now greatly reimbursed, and the gratification of the profits made is wonderful for them. But these prices will also last for some time. If we look at the future markets for fossil fuels, they will stay high. So it's also a great opportunity now to invest in improved energy efficiency and renewable electricity. And one may say that the price increase of fossil fuels is of such a magnitude that almost anything that even the most ambitious climate policy people have talked about is now profitable for purely market economic reasons. So it's a wonderful opportunity for those who have prepared investments and measures motivated by climate policy reasons to do them now and earn money on the pure market benefits of these endeavors. The difference between what we see today and the result of a global carbon tax is that we also have a price increase of uranium. So nuclear power is not getting the benefit that nuclear power would get from just a global carbon tax, because Russia and some of the other countries are also major sources of uranium. And understanding how the war Russia launched and the geopolitical attitudes towards Russia affects the energy system and Russia's incentives is to look at Russia as a superpower of old energy. You can describe them as the world's largest exporter of fossil gas, even as the world's largest net exporter of oil, and together with the other countries in the so-called Commonwealth of Independent States, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, they are providing more than half of the uranium in the world. Their importance in the nuclear sector can also be illustrated by the fact that all nuclear construction projects started outside China since 2019 are projects where Rosatom, the Russian nuclear industry, is supplying the technology. There are not so many, not much happens in the nuclear industry, but all that happens outside China is by Rosatom and even some of the plants in China. If you compare Russia to other fossil fuel exporting countries in the Middle East, it is also noteworthy that when I showed you the pictures earlier about the progress in renewable electricity, especially in solar, you saw that many of the large oil exporting countries in the Middle East are now the pioneers to develop solar electricity. In some of these countries where they have very well-educated leaders, they say we are going to continue to be energy superpowers, maybe even more successful, developing low-cost solar and attracting energy-intensive industry from the rest of the world to our part of the world, where we can get a much more economic benefit out of our energy status than we could when we just exported the fuel. Now we can attract industries to the Middle East. Russia has no such strategy, no such experience, no such industrial capacity. Russia is totally dependent on the continuation of the old-fashioned fossil fuel and nuclear industries. And you can understand with that background why Putin says what he says, where he is making major efforts to discredit the development of renewables, saying wind power is harmful to birds and worms. He's saying that with a zero carbon society will be sent back to the caves. He's ridiculing the German decommissioning of nuclear, saying it doesn't make any sense. And he claims that it's renewable electricity that's responsible for the price hikes in Europe. Most of you can understand that this is just rubbish that he is talking about, but it's serious at the same time, because it's not only Putin himself who says this in public. It's also something that the Russian information war in the world is focusing on, to spread often false, sometimes partly correct, but mostly false information intending to discredit renewable energy development. And Fatih Birol of the International Energy Agency did go out earlier this year with a very strong statement saying that this disinformation claiming that the European price increase and volatility was due to renewables. And he said it is not a renewables or a clean energy crisis. It's a natural gas market crisis. Of course, those of us who are in the sector, we could say it's obvious. Who could even believe anything else? But it is still a problem that this kind of information that is penetrating the rest of the world via so-called social media and often inspired by Russian interests are creating confusion and delaying the development. However, the governments of the world is not easily fooled by such disinformation. And we can look at a couple of the strategies described in public. The US President Biden gave a speech in the very end of March, where his strategy to counter the economic effects of the Russian invasion was, in the short term, to release some of the oil stored for emergency purposes. That's a way of keeping down the domestic oil price. In the midterm, he was providing incentives for American companies that did have concessions to extract more oil and gas from federal lands to do so quickly, not wait. This is, of course, also a fairly short-term solution. And in the long term, he provided a very aggressive, ambitious plan to increase energy efficiency, to increase renewable electricity production, and to electrify the transport sector and heating. Heating that in many countries in the world, including Japan, is to a significant extent based on burning fossil gas, which is now terribly expensive. What's even more significant is that in his speech, he was clear saying this is no longer just a climate issue or an environmental issue. This is now a matter of national security. And as a result, he claimed he was going to use the Defense Production Act, a law passed during the Korean War to give the president the right to actually tell industry in Japan what to do. And he was going to use that to secure supply chains for critical materials that go into batteries, vehicles, and the storage of renewable energy, such as lithium, graphite, nickel, and much more. He's also talking about doing it to increase the production of heat pumps for heating, electric heating to substitute gas, and other technology areas. And this is a quite dramatic shift, because saying it's national security means that other pieces of legislation on state aid and some environmental legislation will no longer be allowed to delay the introduction of these new energy solutions. Similarly, in Germany, which has been pioneering in development renewable energy, some thought initially that Germany would say, okay, we give up, we will increase use of domestic lignite coal for electricity generation, and we will give up the idea of renewable electricity. But on the contrary, or give up the decommissioning of nuclear. But on the contrary, what the Germans said, we're just going to accelerate what we're already doing. We're going to speed up the development of wind and solar, and we're going to do so with similar arguments that this is now national security. It's not just climate policy. So it will be of quite some interest, interesting to see how these statements, for example, that it's an overriding public interest and serve public security, will impact the way regulatory procedures that were making such efforts slow, how they would change now to accelerate the development in Germany. The European Union has also launched the so-called Repower EU project or program to cut the dependence on Russian energy, especially gas. It's a matter of making solar rooftops compulsory, just like in Tokyo, speeding up renewable permitting, saying that projects must be approved within 12 months. And I can tell you, I know Japanese processes are tedious and time-consuming, but it's not always perfect in Europe either. Some processes for permissions take more than a year. They would diversify gas supplies in the short run, meaning they will compete with Japan of Middle East and Qatar LNG, for example. Decarbonization of industry, the fossil-free steel as one example. Increase the ambition to produce biogas from biomass wastes, and start to produce domestic hydrogen from renewable electricity. And this is extremely important because this is also a way of stabilizing the electricity on timescales longer than what can be achieved with batteries. The IEA a couple of days ago went out and said that the world now needs to turbocharge energy efficiency action. Turbocharge meaning now really putting pressure on energy efficiency measures to be fast, because this is the way that we can decrease the demand for LNG and thereby decrease the price of LNG. And even if we decrease the use of LNG, we cannot very quickly do away with all the demand for LNG. So what we can do is, by reducing the demand for LNG, we will decrease the price per unit LNG for the LNG we still need to import. And that's extremely important for the European Union, and it's important for Japan. So we have a common interest between Europe and Japan in particular, that the high fuel prices call for improved energy efficiency quickly. It's also making rapid deployment of renewable source of energy very profitable and urgent. And using these opportunities will make it possible to avoid fossil fuel prices escalating even further. So this is a very interesting opportunity in time where collaboration between Japan and the European Union may be very desirable, and where our complementary experiences and skills in technology and in system development can be used to help each other to reach this common goal of reducing the demand for fossil fuel and keep down the prices. It's interesting to compare how the previous plans in the EU and Japan compare. And this diagram published by Ember a few weeks ago showed that we see a clear difference, that Japan still has the idea of increasing the share of nuclear and a moderate increase in the use of renewables, whilst the emphasis is slightly different in Europe. The emphasis on low-cost renewables is much stronger in Europe, where that will roughly be doubled, and from an already high level, and the nuclear share of electricity will decrease. And this is not really politics, it's more economics in Europe. The cost of new renewables are at the same level as the cost of continued operation of existing nuclear power plants. The new power plants being built in Europe are far too expensive to be and far too slow to be relevant to achieve these targets of reduced fossil fuel dependence. Yeah, and that's what Ember says in their conclusion. Japan needs more homegrown clean energy and more ambition on solar and wind, which is easy to agree with. So it's a dramatic period in the energy industry. Price is higher than ever, and the interest of those of us who live in parts of the world that import fossil fuels is to reduce the demand in order to reduce the price and make our economies able to survive this dramatic price increase. So I hope that those of you who are here and those who listen on the web and so on will contribute to the acceleration of this development that had started already before this crisis. Thank you.
Tomas さんありがとう。
Thank you very much, Dr. Kåberger. Energy transition. Well, this is something that was already economical prior to this crisis, but this crisis has actually boosted the benefits of that energy transition. So carbon pricing, the conflict did have the same effect as putting a price on carbon. Now this crisis should accelerate this transformation. This is now a driving power for that transformation around the world. Energy policy, I think this is a ray of hope in this world of confounding energy policy. Let us go to the second speech. The second speaker is Professor Takahashi of the Department of Community and Society of Tsuru University. He will speak on the topic of questioning Japan's response to the energy crisis. Professor Takahashi has been involved as a committee member of various councils, and in his book that he was published last year, Through Energy Transformation, International Environment Could Change, he states. So this is a very insightful book that he has published last year. So handing over to you, Professor Takahashi.
Thank you for the introduction. So this is a real event. Thank you very much. Thomas, it was a long time no see, and I enjoyed your presentation. So I am going to discuss Japan's response to the energy crisis. Thank you for waiting. So this is about Japan, but as we have just heard from Thomas, and there might be a little overlap, but the structure of the crisis, what other countries are doing in terms of response, I will talk. Energy security issue, of course, has always been critical for Japan, but unfortunately, sufficient preparation has not been made. And under this situation, a crisis has occurred, which is hitting Japan as well. And therefore, what we should do what the government of Japan has done so far, I would like to make some assessment. First of all, the overall situation. I tried to prepare this diagram. Of course, the largest cause was the war in Ukraine, Russia's invasion. So this is military security. Our common sense is changed. It's a major paradigm shift because of Russia's invasion, which is damaging energy security. In the lower half, these are some of the leading economies. In this way, when energy crisis occurs, supply disruption or anxiety about a possible supply disruption will occur. In the 1970s, there was the oil crisis, the supply disruption. East Europe or former Soviet countries, Russia has in the past stopped supply in reality to East European countries and former Soviet countries, but this time some of the Eastern European countries, the gas supply indeed has been suspended, or in neighboring countries like Finland, power supply has been suspended. Yesterday, when I spoke with Tomas, in the case of Finland dependence of power on Russia is like a few percentage, single digit. So it does not mean that at the moment Finland is suffering, but on the other hand, Sweden is making money by export. Supply disruption impact is limited at this moment, but the larger issue is that the fossil fuel prices across the world is rising. So rather than Russia suspending the supply, the global price has risen. And of course, the reason behind that was with the economic recovery post-COVID-19, there was the output gap. And this was exacerbated by the war against Ukraine. Another point which we should pay attention is normally when energy crises occur, the supplier countries tend to be overwhelmingly powerful and the importers will be damaged unilaterally. That used to be the case in energy crisis, but on this occasion, the countries in the lower half of this slide, the countries who import energies, they have imposed financial sanctions, which is an interesting aspect. In the case of the United States, they were exporters of fossil fuel, and therefore they did not depend on Russia, and sanctions was not too difficult. But in the case of EU, this is a place where there is a high dependence on Russia for energy, and they embargo. Normally, when you talk about embargo, you do not export, but they have decided not to import. This is an interesting aspect of this crisis. In a certain sense, again, the fossil fuel has risen because of this sanction, but this coordinated sanction for the non-resource countries, there are big impacts of these kind of behavior. So why can they embargo, decide not to import? Because in the case of Russia cannot easily suspend their export. They have their own reason. And this is looking at natural gas from the left, oil and coal. How much Russia is exporting in terms of the net volume. Natural gas and oil, in both cases, as of 2020, Russia was the largest exporter of natural gas and oil in terms of net export, and in terms of coal, Russia was the third largest exporter. Therefore, a superpower was the word in the earlier slide. But indeed, Russia is the superpower of all the energy, and therefore there might be advantages, but at the same time, dependence on export is a vulnerability for Russia. Please look at this graph. The upper part is the countries that import a large amount of fossil fuel. Lower part is the countries that export a lot. In terms of the volume of export, Russia is the largest exporter. If you look at the line graph, out of the total export amount, it looks at the share, and Russia accounts for more than half. More than half is the export of fossil fuel, so Russia cannot easily suspend their export, especially for large trade partners like Germany and Italy. It is not easy for Russia to easily suspend their sales or export. This is the security of demand vulnerability. On the other hand, the importers, in particular Japan or South Korea or India, most of the percentage is for the import of fossil fuel, and therefore these countries, in terms of the import, if the fossil fuel becomes expensive, these countries do suffer. How do I go back with my page? So the embargo that the EU decided not to import from Russia, about stopping the import, US was ahead of other countries. At the beginning of March, US announced that they will no longer import fossil fuel from Russia, and the UK said that by the end of this year they will do the same. And the most distressed is, UK is no longer EU. So EU is the most trouble because EU strongly depends on Russia. So it was not easy to make the decision. Initially, they said we need a time lag of 5 years, like until 2027. However, after 1 month, by April 4th, first of all, stop coal. Coal is available in more countries, and therefore it is finally distributed, and therefore the import of coal could be suspended by summer, they decided. And then oil, could it be possible to stop oil import? At the beginning of May, when the European Commission floated the idea, Hungary was still opposing the idea. However, most recently, apart from Hungary and other few countries who directly import oil by pipeline, those were exempted. And with some exception, EU has said that by the end of the year, 90% of the oil import can be suspended. As for the remaining natural gas, it might take a little bit more time. But one after another, they have shown that they will stand by Ukraine. And this is characteristic that import is to be stopped. In contrast, in the case of Japan, as you know, in the case of Japan, it's not easy for Japan to do the same. The government of Japan says that it is different for Japan. There's a Sakhalin 1-2 project in Russia. Regarding those Sakhalin projects, at the moment, the Japanese companies continue to hold the interest. That is what the government is saying at the moment. In Japan, more recently, there are discussions that Germany, after all, has failed because Germany has decided to stop nuclear and wean off from coal. It's a two-front war. Wasn't this going too much? And therefore, Germany is now suffering from dependence on Russian gas. That Germany's policy was a failure. Obviously, very high level of dependence at maximum. Germany depended 60% of the gas on Russia. So in a certain sense, the Russia-derived energy crisis, the largest sufferer is Germany. This is the media report we hear in Japan. Indeed, LNG terminal the construction was started, and the minister traveled to Qatar to agree to a long-term import of LNG. As Thomas discussed earlier, there was some perspective that they might decide to postpone the closure of the nuclear power plants in February, but at the ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate, they did seriously think about extension of the deadline of end of the year of closing nuclear powers. But what was announced in March by the government is that the nuclear power plant extension cannot be recommended, that in accordance with the plan, nuclear will be decommissioned, but renewable will be accelerated, and by 2035, that almost 100% of the electricity will be renewable. So as Thomas has mentioned, a very rational, reasonable, justifiable decision has been made. What I was surprised was, on the 1st of May, the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate made an announcement already that the dependence on Russia had gone down as much as this: 35% for gas, 12% for oil, 8% for coal. Only within 2 months or so, Germany had radically reduced their dependence on Russia, a huge effort. Compared to Japan, Germany had depended more, but with a huge sense of crisis. Within a very short period, Germany has done a lot. Thomas also mentioned about Minister Habeck. He referred to his comments. The expansion of renewable is not only for climate measures, it is a matter of national security. Now, this is what the government of Germany is saying. On the other hand, in Japan, quite a lot of media reports is this now the real nuclear renaissance here in the world? Indeed, France, under President Macron, in February, they announced that there will be new constructions. There are 6+8 reactors under a plan. In the case of Britain, by 2030, they say that they could be as much as 8 reactors newly made. By 2050. Currently, 10 to 15% of the nuclear mix will rise to about 25% of the power source. So finally, this would be the nuclear renaissance awaited, that there are such pro-nuclear expectations. This is an area that I would like to discuss with Thomas later in the panel discussion about what he thinks. Indeed, like Belgium, extension of the life of nuclear, that discussion might arise, but after all, the generation cost, the construction cost itself is not cheap. It has not gone down. So the fossil price has become expensive, and therefore, relatively, the nuclear might not look expensive, but making a new reactor, how much reactors will really be freshly constructed? I would like to pay attention here. Then, looking at Japan's situation. First of all, in terms of energy security, what is the situation in Japan? Generally speaking, self-sufficiency data will be referenced. As you can see, Russia, Canada, these are the countries with abundant fossil fuels, 175%, 191% self-sufficiency. They have double the amount that they need in their own country, and the extra surplus are exported. In the case of the United States, at one time it went down, but because of the shale revolution, 106% of self-sufficiency, so they are next exporter. In particular, natural gas, US exports significantly to Japan. China, together with economic development, gradually self-sufficiency has gone down, but because of the situation, as Thomas has mentioned, China is very active in rapid deployment of renewable. They are making a massive effort to use renewable. In the case of our country, Japan, coal, domestic coal was given up, and they went to liberalize the oil, and then there was the oil crisis in the 1970s. The government of Japan went to nuclear energy in order to raise self-sufficiency. This was the major Japanese policy. However, looking at the past graph, 1998, 22% self-sufficiency. Japan's largest energy self-sufficiency was laughable, 22% back in 1998. Not at all successful. in raising Japan's self-sufficiency. Then 2011, Fukushima nuclear accident occurred. Nuclear power plants all went down, and the self-sufficiency went down to 6%, as you know. Right at the moment, it's about 11% of self-sufficiency. So no way in terms of self-sufficiency for Japan. We simply just cannot say we have been successful. And most of the fossil fuel, Japan has to import from other countries. Oil, crude, 99.7%, it's 100% literally. Coal, 9.7%, and natural gas. Off Niigata, we produce some, but 97.8%. But at any rate, almost all of the fossil fuel Japan has to import. But dependence on Russia, yes, Japan does depend on Russia, but not that much, I would say. Natural gas, 8 to 9% from the Sakhalin project. LNG is imported from Russia. But EU is a dependence on Russia. Natural gas 46%, oil 27%, coal 46%. Compared to EU's dependence on Russia, Japan's dependence is not that high. Because of that, 75% of the oil depends on Middle East. That's another problem, that Japan's supply is concentrated in the Middle East. But in this situation, compared to the EU, Japan's situation is slightly better. Having said that, Japan is impacted by the commodity prices, and this is the trade statistics. And this is the per unit price of fossil fuels that Japan has to import, in particular coal. In the case of coal price, it is rising in the last few months. And of course, the oil price, natural gas, LNG prices, they are also rising. But on the other hand, if you look at this graph, every 10 years or so, every 15 years or so, it does spike in a cycle. In the recent case, the gasoline subsidies is being deployed in Japan, 170 yen per liter. It's because it went beyond the threshold of 170, and it said it is after 10 years. Indeed, the price was as high 10 years ago. Therefore, as long as there is dependence on fossil fuel, when prices rise like this or when supply disruption is a worry, this cycle will continue to repeat. Then what could be done? Ultimately, energy self-sufficiency has to be brought up. Energy self-sufficiency means that in comparison to the demand, how much domestic supply will be available. So it is a kind of a division, numerator over the denominator. And the demand, first of all, must be reduced. On the supply side, domestic energy must be expanded. It's after all numerator over the denominator. Both should be worked on. To reduce the demand means reduce energy consumption, meaning better energy efficiency to save more energy. To increase the supply, the fossil, nuclear, renewable must be deployed. In the case of Japan, Japan does not have fossil resources, and therefore it is not possible to increase the orange part, so go to nuclear. Japan was supposed to have been successful in nuclear, but at the moment, new construction or expansion is not possible. Even if Japan decides to make new nuclear or expansion, it's going to be so expensive. So, genuinely, a domestic renewable energy has to be expanded in Japan. The government of Japan does employ this policy as well.
Now, on energy efficiency, after the Ukraine crisis, I've had chances to have conversations with Germans, and they are saying that they are to conserve energy for the benefit of Ukraine, they're saying. We don't hear such discussion here in Japan, but they are looking at the military threat of the Ukraine situation more closer to home. And of course, city gas and electricity prices are going up, and that is why they are working on energy conservation, because in terms of the price, they get to benefit if they are able to save energy consumption. But if the payment for energy reduces, that means that less money would go to Russia. So many people in Germany talk about that. So I was quite impressed. It was as if scales have come off my eyes. It was enlightening. Now, recently, the German government announced measures against energy efficiency to deal with higher energy prices. They are issuing discounts to public transport. Or you want to ride through the months of June, July, and August, the summer period, they can ride public transport all they want at a set price. And this is a very wise policy. This is a modal shift policy. Germans love to drive cars, and many are gasoline powered, and gasoline prices are going up. So if they want to travel, if the public transport prices are reduced, then energy consumption will be reduced in totality, and the dependence on Russia can also be reduced. And this would also make a contribution to emissions reductions. So you can strike three birds with one stone. So that is what they're doing in terms of providing support. But in Japan, there's a lot of heightened discussion about this gasoline subsidy payments. But is this an effective policy here in Japan? I myself do have questions about the merit of this policy. If you go to the regions, people would like it if the gasoline price is lower. So I can understand that sentiment, but the price mechanism, if that is not being used, this is a subsidy that goes counter to the price mechanism. So people will not be inclined to work towards energy efficiency if such subsidies are provided at a budget of 1.2 trillion yen, which was allocated the other day. Kerosene is also covered by this subsidy. Is this a good thing to continue? Or maybe a targeted policy is better to the vulnerable people, but the approach to this issue is different here in Japan compared to that of Germany. Another way is to increase the deployment of renewable energy. We heard about this from Tomas earlier, and various data were presented. So to this extent, centering around the European countries, they have been increasing the share of renewable energy in their power mix. But what about Japan? This period, after the fifth period, we did a lot in solar power. And right now we're at about 20%. But there's a lot of delay. Already back in 2000, compared to Germany and compared to the UK, we were higher, but all of a sudden they have surpassed us. Even when we are reliant on fossil fuels to this extent, we hadn't been increasing renewable energy because, going back to the earlier discussion, renewable energy is decisively lower today in price, but going forward, it is likely to be even cheaper, and that is why the share of renewable energy is going to increase. IEA's net zero by 2050 talks about this. I quote this quite often. By 2050, this is the power mix around the globe, of which 88% would come from renewable energy, according to the IEA. This is an organization that was created for fossil fuels, and they have announced that 88% would come from renewable energy in 2050. So renewable energy, 88%. Please remember this. Nuclear, 8%, hydrogen, 2%, CCS thermal, 2%. This is the target of the IEA. So in the remainder of the time, I'd like to talk about the response by Japan and provide some evaluation. Now, going back to the fall of 2020, I've been saying that Japan has been delayed. I have been criticizing the Japanese energy policy, climate policy, because we're so delayed. And former Prime Minister Suga, in October, he gave a policy speech at the Diet, and he said that he will target at carbon neutrality in 2050. He made that declaration. And from then, there's a lot of activity in energy and climate policy. The direction was changed greatly after that policy speech. And that was the timing of the revision of the Strategic Energy Plan. METI and Agency for Natural Resources and Energy were working very hard, and they have to reach net zero in 2050. This is a new long-term goal, and a lot of debate started. And in 2030, NDC target, where to set the target. Initially, Agency for Natural Resources and Energy saying that emission reduction of more than 40% would be difficult. That was the position that they had. But the Prime Minister's office made that decision to raise the target to the levels of 46 to 50% by 2030. I'm sure that you remember the target being set. Compared to the previous target, this is a very ambitious target that was set for 2030. People said that this is not realistic, this is not bottom-up. There were such criticisms heard, but compared to international standards, you need to have this level of ambition, because otherwise you will not be able to reach net zero by 2050. So based on this long-term goal, power mix was decided. In July, draft proposal came out, and this decision was taken. The current renewable energy is about 19%. Most was accounted for by thermal, but the target for 2030 is, as you might know, renewable energy is to be grown by twice. Compared to the previous target, it is going to be grown by 1.5 times. Nuclear would maintain at 20 to 22%, so the remaining 40% would come from thermal. So that is the numerical target. But Germany is to do 80% renewable energy by 2030. So whether you call this unrealistic or not, well, compared to international standards, still this level is low. Now, just for reference, 2050 reference values were provided. Renewable energy, 50 to 60%. Now, nuclear, CCS, thermal, together combined would account for 30 to 40%. And hydrogen and ammonia accounting for 10%. This is the reference values for 2050. The split amongst these numbers are not disclosed, but with zero emission thermal, it is going to take care of about 30% of the total energy mix. That is the expectation. So I talked about IEA net zero, and compared to that, how renewable energy's share is lower, and as a result, there's higher zero emission thermal contribution in Japan. Now, what I want to ask here is zero emission. As a climate countermeasure, probably the Japanese government would to say that zero emission thermal would be effective, but there is the vertical axis, which is energy independence. Are we going to continue to rely on foreign sources? Zero emission thermal that I have been talking about, that is importing blue hydrogen to use in thermal, and ammonia. And CCS thermal means that the fossil fuels will be used to burn, and CCS would be used to capture CO2. But this would mean that you continue to import energy from overseas. Yes, they may be zero emission, because if you use CCS, of course you have to do this in Australia. It may be zero emission, but in terms of self-sufficiency and independence of energy, it's tantamount to saying that you continue to rely on overseas markets. As long as you rely on overseas sources, you will not have energy independence. So renewable energy, electricity, and with surplus energy that could be used to produce domestically produced green hydrogen, from the perspective of energy independence, this is much more valuable. So energy policy must reflect this. Energy security policy that reflects this perspective is needed. That is what I want to point out. Now, after this strategic energy plan, there was that crisis erupting in Ukraine. So what are the voices being heard in Japan? Well, nuclear to be restarted quickly. And safety review must be made more lenient. Or Minister Hagiuda of Economy, Trade and Industry is saying that we should continue to use coal and oil well. We cannot just rely on decarbonization alone. That is what Minister Hagiuda said. And in March, we had that warning on supply shortage. People were saying that there's not enough investment being made in thermal power plants. We moved too much toward decarbonization. Such voices are being heard. But realistically speaking, solar has produced more than 5 times the expected amount of power generation on that particular day of warning. And because of that press conference, the usage of energy was reduced by about 10%. So through renewable energy and energy conservation, we need to increase self-sufficiency of energy more. So this is the last page. Yes, we do need fossil fuels today, for sure. We cannot abandon fossil fuels from tomorrow, but we need to have a good plan to move us away from the dependence on fossil fuels from the perspective of national security. We must think of this seriously. We have to have 2 pillars, that is energy efficiency and renewable energy. And Europe is working on moving away from Russia, and beyond that, they're thinking about moving away from fossil fuels. This is very closely interlinked with decarbonization. Decarbonization and energy self-sufficiency are compatible. If we rely too much on zero-emission thermal, too much, even if you are able to decarbonize, you will still rely on foreign sources of energy. You will not have self-sufficiency. Japan has advantage in renewable energy, so it's not just decarbonization. We need to work toward fossil fuels. That is the path that Japan should take. And with that, I would like to conclude my presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Takahashi. The use of language words is sensitive and important. Decarbonization is the goal, but to wean ourselves off from coal is the point. Rather than decarbonization society, it's defossilization. A very important message. Thank you very much. We will go on to the panel discussion. May I invite the panelists to come forward? Ms. Mika Obayashi, the director of our institute, and managing director, Mr. Ono, will join. We will talk about the energy crisis and the role of renewables. Ms. Obayashi, I hand over the microphone to you.
Ms. Okuba, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you very much for your moderation. So without further ado, we heard from Dr. Kåberger and Professor Takahashi, and based on what they have presented, we would now like to have a panel discussion. First, Tomas talked about worldwide developments, renewable energy. Even prior to the Russian crisis, there were developments, and now it is being accelerated. And as we face the energy crisis, this is now becoming the core of policy. It's not political considerations only, it is economics. And Professor Takahashi said, what is the situation here in Japan? The government policy level, fossil fuels, the government policy has a strategic energy plan that will continue to rely on fossil fuels. And with this energy crisis, Japan is seeing higher energy prices, and with the earthquake, thermal power plants were closed. There was a shortage of electric power. So Japan put together the 6th strategic energy plan last year, such fundamental review of energy policy is now being required here in Japan. But at the policy level, there's not enough sense of urgency. So first of all, in the beginning of the panel discussion session, I'd like to ask Mr. Ono to talk about how you see the situation today. And the Tokyo Metropolitan Government has provided a mandate to install solar power panels on rooftops, and there are various views being expressed from various quarters. So I'd like to ask Mr. Ono to speak first.
Thank you. What Thomas told us, Chair Professor Kåberger discussed important matters. Climate crisis is so critical that there is no time to lose. In the case of Spain, 43 degrees Celsius, that is the horrible heat that is occurring. Under this crisis, energy crisis is occurring on top of that. In Europe, because of energy crisis, they do not go backwards in the climate response because there's the energy crisis and the fossil prices gone up, that they have to further accelerate decarbonization, and there is a driver. In the case of the United States, not much reported in Japan, but as Professor Kåberger said, there is the Production Authorization Act passed during the Korean War. In the United States, clean energy, including solar or renewable strategy, they are going to accelerate going to expansion of renewable. So energy crisis has occurred and the fossil fuel price has risen. So more than ever in Europe and the United States, they are accelerating decarbonization. What is happening in Japan? From the beginning of this year, clean energy strategy is under development based on the 6th strategic plan, how Japan will decarbonize. The specifics is being made, and the interim report was made recently. The government of Japan's position was clear, which said as follows: we will do our utmost to ensure energy security, and on top of that, policies for decarbonization will be implemented. So we will do our utmost to ensure energy security and then decarbonization, which means decarbonization and energy security. It sounds as if they think about a binary situation and they say energy security is number one. I would say this is not correct. Rather than thinking in that way, in order to secure our energy, we must defossilize, we must decarbonize. The government of Japan's policy is, in the last 20 years, expansion of renewables was done to deal with the climate and to raise the self-sufficiency. They did not take that policy. Professor Takahashi showed us a graph with the leading economies' renewable ratio in the power generation was indicated, and as the graph indicated, compared to 2020, UK, Britain, renewable is above 40%. In the case of Japan, we are barely reaching 20%. 20 years ago, Japan's renewable was 10%. In Germany, it was 6% something, and Britain was like 3.4% of renewable back then. So 20 years ago, ratio of renewable, because of large hydro, Japan's renewable was larger in ratio, but because of policy, in the case of Britain and Germany, they have increased the renewable by 40%. In the last 20 years, they have massively increased renewable, but in the case of Japan, only 10-point increase in the same 20 years, and therefore Japan's low self-sufficiency is stuck low. And the Northern Sea oil was developed in the UK, so self-sufficiency rose, but now it started to deplete. So Britain's self-sufficiency started to go down. But after 2010, including offshore wind, suddenly Britain's renewable ratio started to rise again. Why Japan did not manage to do that? Japan was not successful in the last 20 years. Unfortunately, the government of Japan's policy is, again, Japan is about to repeat the same failure, according to my observation. US or Europe, they are developing renewables, they are improving efficiency very rapidly. They are moving towards decarbonization, defossilization. That does not happen in Japan. Of course, the government is working on the clean energy strategy about the offshore wind. There is some reference, but by 2030, it's like a 10 gigawatt, tiny, and only 5.3 or 5.4 that is working at the moment in Britain. Already 10 gigawatt offshore is working. And the other day, Prime Minister Johnson made an announcement about their energy strategy. 50 giga is the goal by 2030. In Britain, and the demand is 1/3 compared to Japan. So 50 gigawatt in Britain means an impact of 150 gigawatt in Japan. The situation is very different between Britain and Japan. So there is no time to lose for Japan. We must raise the goal of renewable in our mix, and the offshore wind must be accelerated, and of course, solar. And of course, the rooftop, we have to work more on the photovoltaic. The TMG has now announced a new proposal to mandate house builders. That is important, but not only within Tokyo Metropolitan Government, but I hope that other local government authorities and the central government will work in the same direction. That will be my initial remarks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ono. The current situation in Japan, policy measures are not being taken. And earlier, Tomas showed that Ember article, EU, Repower EU, that policy is actually double the speed of Japan's renewable energy policy. Compared to that, Japan, we don't have any such policy initiatives being taken. Now, on the other hand, as was discussed earlier, EU taxonomy and other issues, some conflicting discussions are now emerging. And I have encountered that in various places. I get asked these questions. So I'd like to ask Tomas to give us some comments, if there are any. And Tomas, having listened to Professor Takahashi's presentation, as well as the comment by Mr. Ono, if you have any views about what Japan should do, what Japan should work on, please.
As I mentioned in my presentation, Japan has rich resources, both for further development of solar, but also for an accelerated deployment of wind power. In order to be successful in developing wind power at a large scale, there will also be a need for reinvestments in the electricity grid, in particular if the large wind power resources on Hokkaido and offshore are going to be carried out. Here, Japan now has industrial capacity within the country, with Hitachi Energy being one of the technology leaders now in high voltage direct current technologies. You need cable manufacturing capacity in addition, but the opportunities of building a national efficient grid that can handle hundreds of terawatt hours of wind power in the coming decade is certainly within reach. As I did also mention, the offshore wind power, in order to get down costs, the offshore wind power industry is dependent on a continuous flow of new projects so that the people and the infrastructure involved can be used continuously over a decade or two. And that has been the recipe for success in Northern Europe, that many countries have in the European Union, in Northern European Union, have launched projects to the extent that the companies involved can be continuously occupied with a pipeline of projects planned up to 10, 15 years in advance. So a high ambition, coordination between wind power installations and infrastructure development, and thereby the opportunity to develop an industry with a capacity to deliver offshore wind power at low cost. And note again that when we see costs in Europe at a low competitive level, that is a lower level than what would be necessary to be competitive in the Japanese market, because Japanese electricity prices are now high, and the cost of producing electricity from fossil fuels, the way it is done, is very high. So there are wonderful opportunities. The permission processes regarding both wind and solar are quite tedious. They take a lot of time. They are not predictable. And that creates uncertainty, and for investors, uncertainty costs money. And finally, the electricity market regulation is also introducing uncertainty for new investors, as the established electric power companies who owns the existing thermal power plants also still are owning the electricity grid. In the rest of the world, in most countries at least, and especially in Europe, we have a very clear-cut unbundling. Most often it's ownership unbundling. Sometimes it is legal unbundling, but when it is legal unbundling, we have very strong authorities ensuring that no misuse of this continued co-ownership is possible. And Germany is a good example where the legal unbundling was strictly controlled by an authority, which resulted in ownership unbundling. Because if you can't misuse your control of the grid, why should you own it? Completely different industries, the grid management and the investments in new competitive electricity. So re-regulation of the electricity market to ensure real, transparent, open, fair competition, including ownership unbundling, rational more investments in the electricity grid, and a reduction of the time, could say spent, I could also say wasted on unnecessarily time-consuming permission processes, will provide the opportunity for the Japanese industry to develop efficient production of renewable electricity production at a large scale, and thereby reduce the cost to the Japanese electricity consuming industry, to the households, and improve the competitiveness and economic wealth of Japan.
Thank you very much for that. Maybe I wasn't clear in asking and stating my question. Yes, you did answer my question, the latter part of my question, but EU has its taxonomy, and there's a resolution that is likely to be taken in the parliament, and in which this is widely reported in Japan that gas and nuclear have now been covered in EU taxonomy. But with Power EU, as you might know, at full speed, you're moving towards renewable energy and energy efficiency. So on that point, how is this being viewed in the EU? What is the state of discussion in the EU today?
The taxonomy was a process that went through the political process before the last events in the Ukraine. And while the Commission initially was mainly interested in energy efficiency and sustainable renewable energy, some European industries, with the support of some companies, managed to lobby hard on the process so that nuclear and fossil gas was accepted as transition energy in this document. I think that now, with the background of the Russian invasion and also the reported connection between those companies that have been lobbying the EU Commission and the Russian interests, Rosatom, Gazprom, and their daughter companies and the companies they did business with in Europe, their role in this process, I think it's becoming a bit embarrassing that the European Union legislative process has been so heavily influenced by Russian interests. And I do not believe that we again will see that nuclear and gas will be treated that well after this experience with how troublesome it is to be dependent on Russian uranium and Russian gas. So, as you mentioned in the Repower EU, nuclear and gas is getting very little attention compared to previously. What's fast and cheap is renewables and efficiency.
ありがとうございます。
Thank you very much, Professor Takahashi. In Thomas's discussion and also in your slide, Professor Takahashi, Russia is a superpower of old energy, fossil fuel, and uranium, that Russia is the top exporter. And because of this situation, President Putin says that wind is wrong for water, birds, and that we are going back to caveman. It's the déjà vu. I think I have heard something here in our country, haven't we? For example, about solar, they say that it is not scientific, or countermeasures of climate. US and China say that they don't want to stop climate change, so it's no use that Japan tries to work hard. This kind of propaganda sometimes is heard in Japan. Why do we hear this kind of propaganda? Likely because, as Professor Takashi mentioned, there's energy security. We are about to move on to the next phase, and maybe that is not acknowledged in Japan. In terms of policies, how to ensure energy security. That is a rather difficult question. At METI, I have been communicating with the officials of METI. They say energy security is important, the 3 E's. In terms of METI, energy security is the most important. Of course, all other pillars are important, but it's about national security. The central government is responsible. And the most important method is to use nuclear because no other resource is available in Japan. That is what they have been saying. But on the other hand, when I study the energy policy of METI, I have pointed out that energy policy has been distorted by industry policy. METI is Ministry for Economy, Trade and Industry. It's responsible for industry. Japan grew rapidly in the 1960s. METI was very important. I mean, there are different opinions, but very often METI is considered to have been very successful to promote industry. Industry will cultivate a particular sector, industry with lots and lots of subsidies, and Japan's industry was pulled up to a world level. It used to be MITI in the past, and METI was strong in industrial promotion. They continue to be proud about their industrial promotion cloud. But in the area of their responsibility for energy, nuclear power industry is another area where METI was active. And about the thermal power plant, there are heavy electricity makers. Japanese companies are strong in this area. And high efficiency coal, exporting CCS coal or ultra efficient coal, they stick to this idea. So in terms of energy self-sufficiency, or considering pure energy, the value of renewable could have been recognized much earlier in Japan. However, before promoting the renewable, nuclear power generation or the thermal power generation, these were considered to be so important for Japan and METI. And Therefore, they really could not say that we don't want too much nuclear or fossil, and that has lasted for 20 years. And as a result, efforts over renewable, I think, was delayed. But more recently, in terms of equipment of domestic share, the solar panels are made only by China, that the offshore wind turbines, it's all non-Japanese manufacturers. And that's because of your fault, METI, I would say. Why don't we have the market share? In 2005, Japan was the largest solar panel maker, and there were numerous Japanese panel makers. But because of the failure of METI, you now say that you don't want to use non-Japan made equipment. Industrial policy, of course, is important, but when Japan depends so much energy onto other countries, that is causing Japan's economy as well as national security to be very fragile. We have to recognize this again. Industry policy must not distort our energy policy. Japan, this is the last chance for Japan.
Having listened to that, industrial policy, what was called the industrial policy? What's wrong in the first place? Normally, energy security, climate security. To realize these security policies, industrial policy should aim to realize such security. So policy should be implemented to achieve those goals. Mr. Ono, having listened to the two speakers, what would you say? Thomas, what he said. He talked about nuclear energy. Let me add something to that. EU overall, Repower EU, in that initiative, it's not touching upon nuclear energy. And France and Germany, or France and UK, in the strategies that they announced, they still talk about nuclear power. But whether it's going to be that way, where France is number 1 or number 2 in nuclear power, but of the 50 units, half of them are not operating. Half of them are not operational because of the various defects. And for newly built nuclear, there's 1 unit, Flammarion, but the cost is 5 times the original plan, more than 5 times. When 10 years ago, it should have been operating. But even 10 years after, it's still not operating. So the President Macron did announce that policy, but whether it's going to be realized, I would say that it's not possible. The same thing is true for the UK. They say that they will build or operate 1 unit of nuclear power every year, Prime Minister Johnson said. But Hinkley Point is not realized, and they're not able to get financing. So I don't think this is realistic at all. And Professor Takahashi talked about industrial policy. Yes, your view, I can appreciate your view, but industrial policy must match the new age, the day and age, and that is exactly the problem. In the fossil fuel days, when we had our economy revolving around fossil fuels, we had the bureaucracy, mechanisms, and former bureaucrats. They have gone to various corporations and industry associations. Many of them are headed by former bureaucrats, and there are various former bureaucrats being chair of various councils. They're not being able to adapt to the new era. They will continue to use fossil fuels, and even if they are to grow renewable energy, it's only about twice as what we have today. So in the energy agency of renewable energy and renewable energy resources, and there are coal division and oil division, they would continue to use these fossil fuels rather than converting to other sources of energy. So I would like the organization to be restructured.
Thank you.
I think what you just said, Ono-san, regarding the importance of being able to change is the important thing in Japan. I can understand that Japan in the 1970s saw nuclear power as a better alternative to being dependent on importing fossil fuels, because uranium is easier to store than oil and gas. It was fully rational at that time. But also for uranium, you're dependent on 100% import. It is very expensive today compared to renewables that have become very cheap. And then the important thing is to be able to change your strategy, even if you're old. And I think that is one of the challenges in Japan, to actually together understand and express that the world has changed and we need to adapt to the new circumstances. And this process seemed to be slower in Japan than in Europe, where the thinking 50 years ago regarding nuclear was very similar to the discussion in Japan. It's just that in Europe, the understanding that the world has changed, the industrial economic realities have changed, and we must change to adapt to the new situation. That process has been much faster in Europe. I'm sure it will happen here too, but don't wait too long, because that will be extremely expensive. Thank you.
Professor Takahashi, any comments?
Yes. I have known Tomas for more than 10 years now. And he's always been saying that Japan doesn't change. And I think that's true. But he's been so patient with us, even though we in Japan are not changing fast enough. But finally, we are at a time where we need to change, really. In the past, our gap with Europe has been widening. That is what I have been saying all along. But in 2020, as I said in my presentation, finally, Japan is to move towards decarbonization, carbon neutrality in 2050. So in terms of long-term targets, we're on par with Europe at last. So once there is a major change, there's the swing back. And that swing back tends to be very large. So after Prime Minister Kishida came into power, we are finding ourselves in this situation. But as Tomas said many times over, the world is changing. The world has already changed. So decarbonization is not sufficient. We must move towards defossilization. At least Europe has changed course towards moving away from fossil fuels. The US has lots of fossil fuels, so they probably want to go slower. Probably domestic audience want to move slower. But if you base yourself on economic rationality, and that is the kind of country they are going to be centering themselves on renewable energy. So in this trend, Japan doesn't have fossil fuels in the first place. And it will be understandable if you have fossil fuels inside your country, you may want to make a transition slower. But when we don't have any fossil fuels domestically, why do we want to move slow? That's a mystery. I'm an academic, and from that position, I think we need to be making a rational choice as a consumer. And in terms of business strategy of corporations, you need to be rational. Yesterday, I was talking with Tomas, and I laughed at something, which is that he talked about subsidy-free solar power and wind power increasing in numbers. So fit price, rather than being purchased by the fit price, you'll be more profitable if you sell at a market price. That is how things work in Europe already. Japan, for a variety of reasons, renewable energy cost hasn't been reduced low enough. But once constraints are removed, and if possible, constraints should be removed, and the government should place for priority on renewable energy. That is already stated in the strategic plan. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a few more minutes left. I would like to invite all of you for your concluding remarks. Already, of course, we have discussed, you have already commented about how Japan might change, but this would be your final concluding remarks. Tomas, Ono-san, Professor Takahashi, in that order. Tomas?
First of all, I think I heard Takahashi-san saying something that the US might move slower, but if we look at the real development in the US, you saw them on the top of solar and wind deployment, and as the US, unlike China, is not increasing its total electricity generation, in the US, the solar and wind development is at the expense of the fossil fuels, and especially coal, which decreased dramatically, unexpectedly fast, even during Donald Trump's years in power. So this development of low-cost renewables out-competing fossil fuels is global and does happen in the US as well. But what's important now is that with the current cost of fossil fuels, everything that we have talked about in deploying renewables and energy efficiency is now not only desirable, but also very profitable. And that is important for households, it's important for industries, but it's even more important for countries to use these opportunities to reduce their costs for importing fuels by quickly utilizing opportunities for energy efficiency and renewables. If you fail, it will have consequences for decades to come because industries will not manage to be competitive. Thank you.
ありがとうございます。
Thank you very much, Mr. Ono. We talked about changes in the world, and Europe and the US were discussed, but let me add Middle East to that. Yes, Thomas did talk about a little bit about this. Amongst Middle Eastern countries, they are oil-producing countries, but they are moving towards renewable energy. Saudi Arabia has a power target for 2030, and renewable 50%. There's abundant sunlight. They produce green hydrogen, and their strategy is to export green strategy. Egypt, current plan is 2030, renewable energy to account for 42%. They're revising this to 48%. In the case of Egypt, clean power is to be exported to Europe through grid, international grid. And Saudi Arabia and Egypt, there's an international grid to be connecting these two countries. The company that won the contract is Hitachi ABB. Japanese companies do have that capability. So this capability should be utilized for the energy transition here in Japan. That is all. Thank you.
Professor Takahashi, after Kishida-san took office, under this Kishida administration, economic security is one of the key words. Legislation has been passed. Economic security is the buzzword. This concept is that economic activity is directly linked to national security, so central government must intervene. Indeed, because of the US-China confrontation, it's difficult to oppose. And if it does function healthily, there could be some positives for Japan. However, economic security means that the central government will intervene. That is a negative aspect. To what extent is it going to be in the interest of the Japanese population? Would it not be an arbitrary industry policy? That is the worry by the media. This is the concern that the Japanese community is paying attention. Economic security includes energy and food. Energy and food are the important areas. If economic security is so important, that means why don't you raise self-sufficiency of energy? Why don't they go in that direction? But that kind of administration talking about economic security talks about going back to nuclear or continuing to use a thermal. And really, domestic renewable energy, which Japan has, the priority of Kishida administration has lowered compared to former Japanese administration, which is unfortunate. What exactly is genuine economic security for this country? If you think about that, Kishida administration should be saying something different. Thank you very much. Just one word. It may not sound important, but it's about the terminology about the word and the language. Government of Japan, when they talk about policies, they talk about a Japan version of something. They tend to say the Japanese version of so and so. In the case of offshore wind, Japanese version of a centralized system, for example. But offshore wind businesses tell me that this is the so-called, not the European centralized system. So if you talk about the Japanese version of what is employed in Europe, it is not a genuine comparison. This applies to decarbonization, zero-emission thermal power plant, they say, or green and clean. The terminology, also called blue hydrogen, gray hydrogen, without clear definition. In the case of international debate, the terminology is very important. It's an essential matter. The other day at the G7, by 2035, most of the energy will be renewable, so that it will be decarbonized energy agreed by the G7. Government of Japan said this means more than 50%. So Japanese policy is okay and needs no amendment. So that's the international terminology issue. And again, Japan must adapt to the international level, that Japan must catch up in terms of renewable, that we do not lag behind from the global community. So that is an area that Japan needs to change. Thank you very much for your contribution. Maybe express our gratitude to our panelists, and thank you very much to our interpreters.
Thank you very much, Ms. Obayashi. Thank you to the panelists. From this crisis of fossil fuels, what can Japan learn? We have heard various viewpoints. At REI, in order to accelerate this transition, well, Tokyo Metropolitan Government is considering solar panel installation mandate. So we have put together a report on that, as well as a recommendation on symbiosis between communities, fisheries, and offshore wind. This is downloadable from our website, so please visit our website. So that concludes the event for today. Thank you very much who are here physically, as well as those participating online. Thank you very much.